Star Wars The Grey War, Chapter 8 by Nathan Brown.
8. Rogan awoke from his short sleep, feeling refreshed. Then his eyes drifted over to the menacing pile of supplies he had chosen and immediately felt weary again. He had been trying for hours to put the lightsaber together with no signs of progress. He just couldn't manipulate the tiny pieces all at once. It was too intricate and specific, and he just didn't have the scope to attend to them all at once. He tried dredging up emotions as he had before, but without Darth Cagnew's arrow, he couldn't take all that power and transform it into greater focus and control. In his short life, Rogan had never known failure. Growing up on Barab 1, a planet that praised martial strength above all else, he had forced his way past every obstacle before him. He had lived alone in the jungle, relying on his strength and his skills to survive, and when he had been dragged out of the lonely forest, he'd never had a moment of doubt that he would defeat those standing in the way of his freedom. This feeling of failure wasn't something he was used to or comfortable with. He shook off his artificial fatigue and tried to focus. He gathered the pieces together and tried to open himself up to the dark side. Scene change. We have decided that you will return with Master Sifu to Algaro to find further information on the current location of this Force user, Master Sono announced to her. The way he spoke, slightly strained and over-enunciated, made Kinsa think he didn't agree with the decision. He shared a look with Grandmaster Liftling, and they both cast a sour glance at Master Sifu, confirming Kinsa's assumption. Kinsa hid her smile as she bowed to the council. Thank you, Masters. I appreciate the opportunity to correct my mistake. She turned to Master Sifu and bowed again. Thank you for allowing me to accompany you on this mission. When will we be leaving? She asked, an ounce of excitement inching into her voice. The brown tattoos crisscrossing his face changed shape as Master Sifu smiled widely, showing his row of sharp white teeth. Patience, young knight. Even I do not move so quickly. I have things to set in order before I leave. I'll contact you within the week to set up our departure. Kinsa felt like she was a hot ember that had been doused in water. She no longer had to hide her smile. Of course, they wouldn't be leaving soon. It would probably be at least 2 weeks before they left. By then all traces of Rogan would be long gone, and they would just return to the temple as failures, acting as if nothing had ever happened. Even if they did somehow manage to catch him, he would have wreaked all kind of havoc by then. Scene change. It was becoming increasingly difficult to push away the cramping in his left leg. Rogan had been sitting cross-legged on the sharp stone floor of the cool cave for hours. Before him the many small pieces needed for his lightsaber. The focusing crystal, the hilt, the energy ring, the energy circuits, and half a dozen other tiny pieces floated around, suspended by his force. This was as far as he had ever gotten. Holding them like this had become easy, but still he was unable to put them all together. He started to think about Matok and what he had said about needing to be pure, to be housing the light side within you to create the lightsaber. This still made no sense to him. Darth Cagnew's had done it, and he should be able to do anything a light side Padawan could do, but perhaps there was some dark side equivalent. Already he had tried using his dark emotions, but that hadn't done anything for him. The words of Darth Cagnew's came to him. She had told him that, above all, sacrifice was the most important thing for a Sith, but what could Rogan sacrifice? He didn't believe he had anything. His home, his family, all his possession, he had left or lost all those long ago. All he had left were his time and his life, and he was more than willing to give those up. What was he holding on to? Rogan didn't know if it was a vision from the Force or simply a thought from his own mind, but the image of him closing the eyes of the Zabrak on Alcaro flashed into his mind. He saw it play out over and over, watching as if from someone in the stands rather than his perspective. Slowly the looping image faded away and Rogan was once again staring at the dozen tiny, floating pieces. Why had he done that? He asked himself. He'd had no love for the man. In fact, he disliked him, yet he had shown him that tiny but significant act of respect. It was because of his guilt over the way he had killed him, the way he tortured him for fun. That act was an attempt to convince himself that he was still good, despite his long history of evidence to the contrary. He'd done so much and killed so many, members of his own family even, and it all could have been avoided. If he'd simply been content to go be a normal Barabel, or if he'd taken either of the two opportunities to go with the Jedi, none of it would have happened. All those deaths and all the harm he'd ever caused had been choices he'd made. They were in situations where he had no other options, as he used to tell himself. It was all him. The revelation sent Rajan's heart thumping. He hadn't given up his innocence. That had happened long ago. He'd given up his facade of innocence. He wanted to become an apprentice to a Dark Lord of the Sith. It was time he stopped pretending everything he did was forced on him. He made his own choices, and many of those decisions had led to destroyed lives. He paused for a moment to figure out how he felt about this and what it meant to him. Part of him felt sad, but a larger part of him was relieved. It was a large weight that he'd been forcing upon himself, and now it was gone. Now that he had taken that step into realizing what he truly was, he could stop pretending and trying to be something else. With the pressure of his lies gone, he could feel the force circulating in. Ow! It was like he had been cutting off an extremity from blood and had just released it. Small tingles filled him as the dark force settled into place. He focused in on the group of parts, still floating at eye level, and slowly but surely he manipulated the force to bring them together. Maybe he was actually stronger because of his freeing revelation, or maybe he just thought he was, but either way it was working. As the pieces fell into proper arrangement, Rajan's body shook with anticipation. He moved all the minuscule bits inside and fit the two halves of the hilt together. The metal tube was held together with his force, and he brought it close. He reached into the pack provided by Darth Cognus and brought his welder out. Moving slowly, he used it to fuse the two halves together, hoping he had everything in its proper order. He released his force hold on the lightsaber and let it drop into his hands. He rolled it around in his hands for a while, nervous to test it out. This was the moment of truth. While he didn't know what would happen if he hadn't put it together correctly, he was pretty certain it wouldn't be good. He held the surprisingly light, thin hilt in his gigantic hands, his thumb hovering over the small, red activator. Before he could think about it too much, he pressed down. He heard the signature snap as a brilliant blue blade of energy shot forth from the hilt. Rogan breathed a sigh of relief as he stared at his new weapon. Rogan held the dangerous weapon away from him and stood to his feet, forcing his aching legs to obey his commands. He held the blade aloft, surprised at the strange weight. He supposed he knew in his head that the energy blade wouldn't weigh anything, but it was still extremely unexpected. The light hilt felt heavy now in comparison to the weightlessness of the rest of it. He took a few practice swings and it felt even stranger than just holding it. He wasn't used to the weapon, but he still had a couple days before Darth Cognus came back. He would get the hang of it by then. Scene change. Darth Millennial looked over his vast empire and marveled at Darth Cognus' folly. His old master planned to send one man, an apprentice who didn't have any true relationship with the Force, against his small army of loyal Force acolytes. His new Brotherhood of Darkness would crush this would-be assassin into dust. This had always been a weakness of Cognus, one of many, holding to this foolish rule of two. The belief that the dark side is strongest when hosted in one being, as if the dark side of the all-encompassing force was some finite pool, and the more people who drank from it, the less everyone got. The all-knowing force had chosen him to rebuild the Brotherhood of Darkness Darth Bane had so foolishly destroyed. A pair of deluded aliens could not stop his destiny. He almost laughed as he shook his head once more in disbelief. The force would now allow him to be defeated. How could his old master not see this? He welcomed this foolish follower of Darth Cognews, welcomed him to his doom. Scene change. Cognews took a deep breath as she stepped onto the cold planet, the icy fresh air shocking her lungs. She felt Rajan's presence but couldn't see him in the blinding white expanse. She wrapped her robe tighter around her small frame, trying to protect herself from the cold, whipping wind and waited for him to show. After about a minute she saw a tiny black dot in the sea of white trudging toward her. As he neared her she saw the lightsaber hilt in his hand, having nowhere to strap it to, and she allowed herself a small smile. As Rogan came closer she dropped her smile and hardened her face. "Does it work?" she asked, practically yelling to compensate for the distance and the howling winds. In response, Rogan simply activated the lightsaber, the bright, pale blue blade shining. Darth Cognews reached out her hand and pulled the saber into her hands. She almost laughed aloud at the surprised face of her apprentice as she used the force to pull it from his grasp. She inspected the saber. Its blade was a darker blue than her own and the hilt was shorter and thinner, but it seemed to be in working order. She had a strange, dull feeling as she held the weapon. She didn't know what it meant, so she simply ignored it. She could deal with it later. By the time she was done inspecting the lightsaber, Rogan was standing before her. She handed him his lightsaber back and gave him a nod of approval. "Kneel," she commanded him, with a harsh whisper that cut through the wind. Rogan quickly fell to his knees, the top of his head still reaching her chin. She ignited one of her lightsabers and held it lightly against the base of Rajan's neck, burning through his scales and into his flesh. This was the Sith's version of cutting off a Padawan braid. "Wear this scar proudly," she said, pulling her robe down to reveal a similar scar that her master had given to her a lifetime ago. "No longer are you a citizen of the galaxy. No longer are you a Barabel, you are only Sith. You must be loyal only to the survival of the Sith. You may choose a new name if you wish, to signify this rebirth." Scene change. Rogan thought on this for a moment. He was eager to give up his old life. He had nothing to hold on to and nothing he wanted to remember. Despite his desire to completely move past his old life, he couldn't think of a name. He thought about what else Darth Cognews had told him was important about being a Sith, cunning and patience more than physical strength, and he knew what his name would be. "Naman," he declared confidently. Darth Cognews gave him a questioning look, asking silently for an explanation. In Barabel mythology, Naman was the trickster god of wisdom and death. He is the patron of thieves and seen as an evil deity by my people. He briefly held the throne of the gods by tricking his older brother Sajid, the god of war and strength, and convincing other gods to turn on him. Darth Cognews nodded her acceptance of the name. "Then fall away and die, Rogan the Barabel, and rise and be born, Naman, the last of the true Sith and heir to the legacy of Darth Bane." Naman rose to his feet and felt truly reborn. He felt that he was rising above, transcending the grief and guilt, the petty emotions of his past. "Come," Darth Cognews barked as she turned around, interrupting his thoughts. "It's time to begin your training." He used the force to pull High's saber into his outstretched hand, trying to show off his new proficiency in the force since his revelation in the cave. He followed his master onto the ship, and into his new life. Scene change. Peace is a lie, there is only passion. Through passion I gain strength. Through strength I gain power. Through power I gain victory. Through victory my chains are broken. The force shall set me free. Naman's chest heaved, his body desperately trying to suck in oxygen. He was so tired and distracted he hardly registered the words. He was amazed and annoyed looking at Darth Cognews, breathing smoothly and hardly sweating at all. They had just completed a short but brutal training session, and now it was a time for a lesson in Sith philosophy. This is the code of the Sith. Do you understand what it means? Darth Cognews asked him. Naman thought for a moment, trying to think of an answer and giving himself time to catch his breath. It means that we must follow the Force to be set free, he answered hesitantly, focusing on the last line of the code. The Force was still extremely confusing to him. On Barad 1 he'd had no one to talk to about the Force, so he'd been forced to come up with his own theories. He thought it was just a tool, something that made him faster and stronger than those around him, mostly useful in a fight. Then when he'd discovered himself on that ice planet, he still thought of it as a tool, just a more subtle one. In these last 2 weeks with Darth Cognews his views on the Force had been changed completely. She taught him that the Force was more than just a tool or a weapon that only he possessed. It was a metaphysical thing that wove its way through everything in the galaxy. It was expansive and infinite and could be drawn on by beings like him, beings with a greater connection to it. He'd also learned that, unlike what he'd been told before, there wasn't truly a light or dark side of the Force. There was simply freedom, the strength that came with it, and restrained. It wasn't like a switch that, once flipped, made the Force user was either light or dark. The Force was all-encompassing, light and dark, not one or the other. When Force users said, the dark side or the dark path, what they were in fact referring to was the entirety of the Force. The Sith accepted all of it while the Jedi feared and stayed away from the parts they saw as evil, and thus were held in chains they had made for themselves. No, Darth Cognews responded firmly. The Force is not a tool for you, but neither are you simply a tool to be used by the Force. That is not freedom. Only the weak and the foolish pray to the Force for guidance and follow after what their delusions tell them is its will. If you submit yourself to the Force, trusting in it fully and doing nothing for yourself, you are not worthy to call yourself a Sith. It is up to you to forge your own destiny, not the Force, not your past, not even me. Nama nodded, absorbing the information and trying to find a better answer. We are done for the day, Darth Cognews said suddenly, rising to her feet and giving him a quick bow. We will speak about this tomorrow. Have an answer for me by then. Naman worked to hide his disappointment until Darth Cognews had left. He felt like he had failed by not thinking of the right answer fast enough. Failure was an emotion he was starting to get used to. Scene change. Naman grunted in frustration and pain as once again one of Darth Cognews' blades lightly touched against his scales, adding to his plethora of burns. He knew that Cognews wasn't even going half speed, yet he still couldn't keep her blades at bay for more than a minute at a time. It was all just so strange, the weightlessness of his blade and the confusing shape and capabilities of her weapons. They were called guard shotos or lightsaber tonfas. The handles were longer than a normal lightsaber, and they had a secondary handle that stuck out at a 90-degree angle, perpendicular to the rest of the weapon. She held this secondary handle, and the actual blade ran backwards, parallel to her forearms, from just under her wrist to her elbow. She mostly used them defensively, to block strikes until she could get in close and do damage. By holding the secondary grip loosely, she could swing the blade forward suddenly. She wore a thin Cortosi's cuff on her forearms that protected her from the heat of the saber's blade. As if the strange weapon wasn't enough, lightsabers had a secondary activation button on the hilt. When she pressed these, the perpendicular handle became parallel to the blade and made them regular lightsabers with short blades, simply called a shoto. This let her switch quickly between the different forms of lightsaber combat and move fluidly between offense and defense. You're too slow, Darth Cognews chastised him for what felt like the millionth time in the last month. You put too much into the swing. You let me know where you going to attack before you even move your arm. A lightsaber takes much less effort to swing than a sword. You need to use your strength to restrain the blade so as not to lose control, not to swing it like it's a great battle axe. Try again. Scene change. Cognu sighed inwardly as Naman swung yet another painfully obvious strike. She brought up her arm to block and lashed out with her foot, kicking the back of his leg. He stumbled forward, off balance. She took a quick step forward and swung her saber forward, touching it lightly against his ribs. He had to quickly step back to avoid falling on top of her blade and almost fell to his back. Naman tried to hold his head high, but Cognus could see his sadness at his continual failure. Cognus herself was disappointed with his lack of progress with the lightsaber. In all other areas of the Force he was progressing rapidly, but not this. She had seen his skill in the gladiator pit and was surprised at how slowly he was adapting to his new combat. She had expected that he would have to work harder at the more subtle areas of the Force and would excel in this area, and yet it was the exact opposite. Again, she demanded, waiting for his next attack, she would need to find a solution.